Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Dominic Morrow and I'm the Marketing Director here at Extra Duty Solutions. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for our latest webinar titled How to Safeguard Your Extra Duty Program. We have a lot to cover in a short amount of time, so let's get right into this with some house rules here. First, we'll send you a link to the recorded version after the webinar today so you can revisit at any time. In that email, we'll also provide the slide deck from today's presentation. That'll be available in PDF format. And we ask you to please hold any questions until the end of today's presentation. We allocated a few minutes at the end for our Q&A session. And lastly, if you're interested in learning more about EDS, feel free to do so by requesting a consultation in the chat box below. So now let's get into today's agenda. First, we'll briefly recap our last webinar, the most common pitfalls of extra duty programs. And if you missed any of our past webinars, no worries. You could always catch up by streaming them directly from the news and resources section on our website at www.extradutysolutions.com. Next we'll cover officer judgment risks and how they affect your agency. And following that, we'll dive into program operational issues as it relates to extra duty programs. And then we'll discuss common detail scheduling mishaps and the fallout from unfair job awarding processes. And now as we come towards the end, we'll share a pre-recorded interview with Sayreville, New Jersey's Chief of Police, Chief John Zabrowski. And lastly, guys, we'll open that chat up for our Q&A session. So as discussed, our featured guest today is Chief Zabrowski of Sayreville, New Jersey. He is a veteran law enforcement professional with over 25 years of experience, all at Sayreville Police Department. Now, during this interview, Chief Zabrowski provided us with a lot of insights into the evolution of extra duty and how it changed over the years. So I'm really excited to share that with you towards the end of today's presentation. Today's presenter is no other than our CEO, Rich Milliman. And for those of you who don't know, Rich has an extensive background in business services and operations. Prior to co-founding EDS with his business partner, Adam Bryan, Rich was involved in operational risk, security, and back office operations at the world's largest hedge fund. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it off to Rich so we can get started with today's presentation. Rich, welcome.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it. So let's just recap really quick the pitfall webinar we did last month. And really, if you think of what can go wrong, there's two buckets that things fall into. There's the officers doing things that are suboptimal, and then there's the program itself that causes things that can go wrong. And just as a really quick recap on the officer side, you have legal liability, so inadequate workman's comp, or an officer that inadvertently causes damage to premises, or bodily damages, or a cruiser causes damages, that can go wrong. There's unfairness allegations stemming from a scheduling algorithm that is inherently unfair or gameable. So you have complaints and union grievances and so on stemming around that. There's potential for unsafe behavior from officers, working too many hours, for example, or other types of unsafe behavior, and related to that, unethical behavior, doing things that they shouldn't be doing, behind the scenes, or without knowledge of superior officers. I'm thinking about things like no-show jobs or double dipping, and unfortunately, we've seen it in a lot of different agencies. This can cause reputational risk, along with some other things, reputational risk to your agency. And then there's a whole host of customer issues, difficulty in engaging with the department, like calling a department and nobody answers the phone, or on weekends nobody answers the phone, or difficulty in finding out if an invoice has been paid because they're calling the department and invoicing is handled by finance. So just basically what you'd consider suboptimal customer experience. And then on the program itself, what can go wrong? Well, you have a lot of financial things that can go wrong, because depending on the size of your program, you could be floating a substantial amount of money, and this costs money. The cost of money is not zero. So you have float expenses, and you have bad debts that could cause problems financially. In addition, you have an administrative burden, and it doesn't matter if you have a small program or department or a large one, somebody is doing everything that we're talking about and running this program. Usually it's more than one person, and usually it's times two, because you have people in the department, then you also have people in the city that are doing the finance side of it. So the administrative burden can get out of hand, or people can become overburdened and doing a lot of things poorly rather than one or two things well. And then supply and demand problems, where you've got you know, in the northern agencies, a lot of times in the summer, they can't handle all of their road jobs, their traffic jobs, because all the road work is done in 4 months in the north, depending on where you are. Or you have, you know, your New Year's Eve problem and things like that, where you just are completely overburdened. And this leads back to reputational risk or customer issues, where people are dissatisfied because they're calling a department and they can't get through, or they do get through and then you can't handle the amount of work that you have. So there's supply and demand issues too. So if you step back and squint from these what can go wrong issues, they really fall into two buckets. One is officer judgment, unsafe, unethical, unflattering, illegal behavior by officers. And then you also have program operational risk, which is inherent to the mere fact that you have an extra duty program. These are legal and financial risks, and the reputational risks due to poor customer service or officers doing the things they shouldn't be doing. So let's talk about solutions to these types of problems. So we'll start with the officer judgment risk. So the first one that we see in a lot of departments is officers working too many hours, which can lead to fatigue, mental and or physical fatigue. And the solution to this is basically policies and an infrastructure that supports those policies. So it's not uncommon that departments have policies of, for example, you cannot work more than 16 hours in a 24-hour period, off duty plus extra duty, or you can't work more than 10 hours or 12 hours contiguous extra duty, or you can't work more than 70 hours in a 7-day week, or total, or 40 hours of extra duty in a 7-day week, or so many hours in a month, or whatever. But having rules like that is not uncommon. It's perfectly reasonable. And of course, it's only as good as how much you're going to police that rule. So and ideally, you don't have to police the rule, because you have infrastructure, software, and so on that precludes officers from violating these types of hour rules. So if an officer, for example, tries to sign up for 3 8-hour extra duty details in a row, which would have him working 24 contiguous hours after the first or certainly second shift of being signed up for, when he tries to get the third one, he would get a box that says, hey, you can't take this, it violates a rule. Or if an officer tries to work 80 hours in a week between his 40 hours of on duty and then 43 hours of extra, at some point he gets a box, or the superior officer gets a notification. There's something before the fatigue sets in that precludes it from ever setting in. That's the ideal way to do this, to preclude it through infrastructure and rules. If the infrastructure is not sophisticated enough, then you have to have reporting and so on the back end, so that you can see, well, who worked more hours than they should have, and take action then. But that's less than optimal, because the violation has already occurred. The fatigue is already set in at that point. But mental and physical fatigue is a common problem that we see. A second one is officers working details that that put the reputation of the department in question, or actually worse than that, present legal liability. So let me give you a down-to-earth example. We've had this happen a couple of times, where, let's say, a jewelry store calls and says, hey, we want service in this particular geography, and it's a new vendor that has not required service or requested service from that department previously. And our account teams, goes through the questioning of, what are you going to have the officers do? What do you want security? And they say, and we've had this actually happen. Well, first we want the officer to get the master key, and then go into the back room and then count the Rolexes. And I'm sorry, but this is an extreme amount of liability for the department. So, we involve the chief and or legal at that point. But you should be watching for this type of thing too. And the way you solve this is, number one, terms and conditions. And really, you need terms and conditions both for the vendor and the officers. But for the vendors, clearly, there should be an agreed upon and signed off upon terms and conditions that officers will not work the following types of details. So, you shouldn't work at, adult bars. You maybe not work liquor at all in some cases. Won't work certain types of shows that portray policing in a negative light. We've seen a lot of rules like this that you need to police on the upfront end so that you don't have officers show up into a detail and they realize they shouldn't really be there to begin with. And likewise, officers should be trained on what's acceptable and what's unacceptable. We had a case where it was a supermarket who had an officer for security, and the officer told our account team that he was asked to collect shopping carts in the parking lot and bring them back to the shopping center. Well, this is not the type of thing you want on YouTube, and everybody walks around nowadays with a movie camera on their phone, so you can easily imagine a uniformed officer being videotaped collecting shopping carts in the parking lot, and the entire town asking, well, is this really where a taxpayer money is going? So education on the officers through ordinances or rules internal to your department can also preclude this type of behavior. There shouldn't be any surprises, basically. There shouldn't be anything where you're surprised an officer took on a certain detail, worked a certain detail, or took on a certain task within a detail. And your lawyer shouldn't be surprised either. The third officer judgment risk we should talk about is illegal behavior. So this is beyond the poor judgment behavior. This is shakedowns, no-show jobs, double dipping, skimming. And before you say, well, we would never have that here, it's more common than you think, unfortunately. Nobody goes into policing thinking, oh, good, I'll get a bunch of extra duty jobs and do no-show jobs and make a ton of money. But 1 inch at a time, we've seen people get there. So here again, just like the precluding the mental and physical fatigue, your infrastructure should be able to catch certain things and preclude certain things from happening. So for example, double dipping. That one's fairly easy to combat with the right infrastructure. So if your on-duty scheduling software talks with whatever extra duty administrator you're working with, their infrastructure, or your extra duty software, then you should be able to preclude an officer from working on duty and extra duty at the same time. If those infrastructures don't talk because you have completely separate systems, at a minimum on the back end, you should have reporting that would reveal such bad behavior. We have, for example, some of our clients where we only provide our extra duty program administration service and they're not using our on duty software, but we can provide uploadable reports to whoever they're using for on duty scheduling, so that they can see on the back end, did anybody work over their on duty and their extra duty at the same time. As far as the other ones where it's shakedowns, no-show jobs, there you have to make sure that vendors feel comfortable communicating to either you in the department or the city or your extra duty administrator such behavior. So we get calls every now and then where a vendor will say, hey, I was pressured to hire 3 more officers at the day of the job when the officer showed up, and I don't think that was that was the right thing to do. I don't think that was fair. I don't think I should have 4 officers. I think 1 would have sufficed. And we would report that to our liaison in the department, who will take it from there. But the important thing is open lines of communication. And if it's one thing that we realized in administrating programs in all these different states, is a lot of vendors are not comfortable calling a police department, a chief, a liaison with negative feedback, either about individual officers or the behavior of a group of officers. We get those calls because we're not viewed as the department, and we're kind of a safe place to communicate that information. But whether you're using us or you're administering your program internally, please ensure that vendors have an open line of communication to somebody or a group of people they feel comfortable talking to, because you want to hear this if and when it happens and not 4 months later when a newspaper reporter calls you and already has a story, and now the chief has to go on national news to talk about it. Skimming is basically, you see this when an officer takes a detail and then quote unquote sells it to another officer. So if you have a first come first serve type of a program where anybody can take any job, and you allow officers transfer jobs, you have a non-insignificant probability of skimming going on. This is when an officer signs up for a job, takes it, and then before the job gives it to another officer and says, well, look, it pays 50 an hour, I'll take 10, you take 40. Or the officers, if they're collecting cash on site, which I would never recommend, but I see it happening in a lot of places, the amount of money they collect is higher than they should be collecting, and they're keeping money off the top. So skimming is something that you can eliminate through eliminating transfers or keeping a careful track on officers transferring details from one to another, and also ensuring that you have a program set up where officers are not collecting money at site. Cash on site is sort of never the right way to go. Again, everybody has a movie camera, and the last thing you want on YouTube is an officer getting a white envelope outside of a bar at 3 in the morning on Sunday to be posted on YouTube. And also, it puts your officers in a situation where they can have to become collection agents. So somebody doesn't pay and says, hey, at the end of the night, I'm sorry, we didn't make as much money as we thought we were going to make tonight. We can't pay you the $300 we owe you. If the officer's responsibility is to collect that money, what's going to happen next? And are you comfortable when that does happen, that it's going to be on YouTube on Monday morning? So those are the things you need to think about in terms of solving those problems. Let's talk about operational risk problems. The first and the biggest and the most common is a scheduling algorithm that is wholly faulty. There's problems with it. If you have a first come first serve way of divvying up jobs, in other words, a job comes in, it gets posted or communicated, and any officer can take it. There's a different set of problems where you might have some officers that are sort of quote unquote hanging around or always on their iPhone looking for details, and they're taking more than their fair share, and that can lead to unfairness unfairness complaints. But if you have another way of divvying up of details, like you have coordinators, internal coordinators, and they're handing out details, this can easily lead to unfairness allegations, and those allegations can lead to union grievances and the chief having to spend his time on something like that. Or we've even seen cases where the chief, in multiple situations, just paid 2 officers for one job because the one who took it and the one who should have got it. Operational risk number 1 is having unfair scheduling algorithms, and the easiest way to resolve that is to think through how are you divvying up these jobs, and have infrastructure that divvies them up in that way, and keep the records for 7 years and have it completely transparent, and have it easy to understand. We did a webinar a few months back about what looks fair in scheduling algorithms, and if you step back and squint at scheduling algorithms, the ones that are the best, that enable the least number of unfairness allegations and union grievances and so on, are the ones that are A, simple, and B, transparent. So if you have a scheduling algorithm that it would take a NASA engineer 3 years to understand, you're going to have problems with it. So that's the biggest operational risk solution that we have for you. The other ones are inadequate insurance. A lot of times, extra duty programs kind of pop up and they start growing, and the next thing you know, you've got a $1 million extra duty program that's not really being managed. It's never been really looked at in a thorough way. I mean, everybody who's listening to this, your role is to ensure public safety. It's not to run a security firm within your police department or a sheriff's organization. So a lot of times the tough questions are never asked. It's never looked at in a thorough way. And I'm surprised how many times we walk into the department and start asking questions about insurance, and people look at their shoes and they're not really quite sure how it works. So please ensure that you engage the city or the municipality that you're in on insurance and ensure that your officers are covered from a liability standpoint and a workers' comp standpoint when working extra duty details. On liability, that would be any kind of damage caused by an officer inadvertently while working a detail. And it could be, it doesn't have to be something obvious. It could be, you know, I heard one case where an officer was working a security job at a bank. He very nicely opened the door for somebody to help them in, and inadvertently the door hit somebody's face and caused dental damage. You now have an insurance policy, an insurance problem on your hand. So make sure you're covered for these types of things. Workers' comp's another one. Does your workers' comp cover officers when they are working extra duty detail in an extra duty capacity? You need to make sure that's the case. And we do see some departments that kind of try to push that off onto the vendor. So they make the vendor cover the insurance under their workers' comp while they're working details. And this is a potentially viable way to go, but it's very, very tricky. So there are some states, for example, where if you have a company with less than 7 people in it, you don't have to have workers' comp insurance. Well, if, you know, a little church will not have more than 7 employees. So if an officer's working at church and gets injured, and that agency has pushed off the responsibility of workers' comp onto the vendor, in this case, the little church, you have a mess on your hands. So just make sure you're buttoned up with this. The other, another solution, a problem and solution is the reputational risk. And this is a customer experience. And what I mean by that is, you know, think of yourself as buying a plane ticket and going on an airline. Your experience with that gate agent when you get to the airport is the reputation of that airline, right? So it's the same way with everything else. If you have a bad waiter at a restaurant or you have bad food, the reputation of the restaurant is in question, not just that waiter. We tend to generalize these things. And the same is true in extra duty programs. If somebody calls at 6 o'clock and the phone rings and rings and rings and nobody answers it, they're going to have a issue with the police department and a negative opinion of how that police department or sheriff's office is managed. If they get transferred from person to person in person, if they get transferred to a fax machine, all these things have happened. It's going to be reputational risk. So my solution here is kind of a unique one, but have somebody's spouse call and pretend they're a gardener or a landscaper and try to hire an extra duty officer. And have them call during the day, have them call at night, have them call early in the morning to cancel a job on a rainy day and see how it goes. And would you be satisfied if that was you? So you want to stress test your procedures and do kind of a mystery shopping solution to see how well you're doing on customer service, because it does reflect on the department generally. And we have heard, you know, I've heard command staff level people say, well, the extra duty thing has something to mean focus on what we do. We're here to protect and serve. We're here to ensure public safety. Extra duty is kind of on the side. We don't really focus on it. And that's true. I agree 100% with that, but it also doesn't matter. You know, if somebody has a bad experience with the extra duty program, they're going to generalize that to how well or how poorly they think the whole department is being managed. Keep in mind, most law-abiding citizens, if they're going to interact with the police department or a sheriff's office, it's going to be through the extra duty program. It's not going to be because they're being led away in handcuffs. So it's very important that the perception by the community is positive for your extra duty program. And therefore, I would encourage you to stress test your procedures and do mystery shopping on it. And then the final one here is inadequate transparency. That's a very common problem where you have some type of infrastructure or software or procedures which don't enable officers and superior officers to see who's working where when. Why did I not get this detail when I signed up for it? Why did somebody else get the detail? You know, sometimes vendor documents are required before a vendor can hire officers, like signing off on terms and conditions or providing a certificate of insurance. Are these things organized? I mean, once somebody sends in a certificate of insurance, where does it go? And what happens next year when it expires? Is somebody watching these things to make sure that they get re-upped and that the vendor still has insurance after 1 year. We have a whole team in our group here at Extra Duty Solutions that does nothing but make sure a certificate of insurance don't ever expire for vendors. So these are important things to ensure that the flow and the transparency are visible and on the up and up, and everybody who needs to know does know when they should know. right? So money flows are another thing. Again, cash on site is not transparent. Cash on site is very untransparent. And you don't know how much cash and who's getting it and where it goes. And has taxes ever been paid on this stuff? Has any of it ever been reported? So you want to make money flows known and tracked. You do not want the IRS showing up and start asking questions that you cannot answer. And finally, in this topic, rules should be automated and enforced via the infrastructure. So like we talked about the number of hours worked and so on. Ideally, your infrastructure takes care of this for you in an automatic way. So officers can't violate certain rules or do things that are unbecoming to the agency and in a non-transparent way. And either your administrator and or the infrastructure is taking care of it for you. So I'm going to turn it back over now to Dom, who's going to introduce us to Chief Zembrowski.
Thanks, Rich. Great job as always. Now I'd like to share with everyone a recent interview that we recorded with Sayreville, New Jersey's Chief of Police, Chief John Zembrowski. And as a friendly reminder, guys, we invite you to stay on after the interview for our Q&A session. So as promised, we now present you with this exclusive interview. Chief Zembrowski, thank you for your time today and your continued dedication towards both the public safety sector and serving your community. Let's start with your background in law enforcement. Our audience would love to learn a little bit about your road to becoming Chief of Police here at Sayreville.
Well, actually, it's pretty simple. Born and raised in Sayreville, and at age 22, took the application, took the test, and shortly thereafter hired with the Sayreville Police Department, and have spent the last 32 years here. And I've been very lucky. I've had the opportunity to serve in varied assignments throughout the department through those years, whether it's in the uniform or the detective division. And I think in particular for this case, as time in administration. So I had a good opportunity to see how this off-duty issue relates to the police department.
You mentioned how you've been a lifelong resident here in Sayreville, New Jersey. Did your familiarity of your surroundings play a role in your interest to serve the community? And were there any other factors that inspired you to pursue a career in law enforcement?
Yeah, I can't say that that was something I wanted to do as a small boy, but everyone has someone that they look up to, right? And I had an uncle who was a police officer in a local town, and he was that average, everyday city police officer that would walk the beat. Everybody knew his name. When he came up to somebody, he had that smile. He had the discussion with them. Hey, how's your day? What's going on? They all knew him. And when time came for needing help, assistance, he was the first one that they called for. And I looked at that and I said, that's really truly what the police officer needs to be, who we look up to. And I just said, if I get the opportunity to be in some type of service, that's what he's the person that I would like to be able to emulate. And I was very lucky that the opportunity came to me, and I hope I've done his reputation well.
Let's take a step into the world of extra duty. How has the need for off-duty officers evolved over time? Do you see a larger demand for these officers now in comparison to maybe earlier in your career?
I think that that's changed over time, in that the role of the off-duty officer has expanded exponentially over the last 10 or 15 years. It used to be that it was a very small row on certain construction sites when they were large in nature. Now, just about any type of construction, any type of security that may impact the public in any way, our officers are working off-duty jobs now.
So it seems that there are more opportunities for officers to work extra duty details. What are some examples of an officer maybe benefiting from working extra duty?
Well, it benefits the officers financially with an opportunity to earn a few extra dollars so that they can live a comfortable life, be able to do different things for their families. From the public safety standpoint, it is a huge opportunity to be able to make sure that our public is safer, whether it's simply just driving the roads, whether it's a pedestrian on a sidewalk, or perhaps the students at school.
Do you feel as though extra duty programs can make a positive impact within your community? And if so, how?
Well, I think again, it brings it back to the street level where, I mean, communication is the biggest element, I think, in policing. And this is the opportunity for the officer to meet our public in many different respects, whether it's at the school setting, whether it's simply on a road setting, or for any other issue it is. And ultimately, this is still a people business. And that off-duty component has become a very big issue and relating to communication and people business.
For those who may not be aware, Sayreville PD does utilize extra duty solutions for their extra duty program administration needs. Chief, can you share some of the common challenges that you faced as it related to extra duty prior to partnering with EDS?
Well, first of all, I think because time has changed, the way that we were assigning and the way we were managing our off duty was antiquated. We had a clerk who was working, or this was supposed to be a part-time position, but it had grown to really a full-time position, and not really a full-time, it was a 24-hour position, and it simply couldn't be managed in that way anymore. And what was happening is, number one, we weren't managing our off-duty jobs the way we should have, and number two, morale with our officers was starting to suffer.
I'm sure fellow agencies who are listening right now can totally relate to that, especially if they're trying to manage all this in-house. Can you share with our audience how your program improved since partnering with EDS?
Well, first of all, let's remember that the Sayreville Police Department was the first agency that actually contracted with Extra Duty Solutions. And I would have to say, out of all the decisions I've made throughout my career, this may have been one of the best. And primarily that's because of the issue of officer morale. Extra duty issues were becoming a morale issue because there are thoughts, there were discussions, because first of all, there was no visuality, you couldn't see who was being assigned. So there became talk in the hallways, and this is very, very common in police departments, where officers were saying, I don't know why I wasn't assigned a particular job, how come some officer has more hours than another officer. So extra duties pretty much took that and put it on a app platform that allowed all our officers to see everything. From a management standpoint, we now have 24-hour coverage. So it wasn't that my part-time clerk, who might have been not working because she was on vacation, so now it was assigned to another clerk, and then after hours it was assigned to a station commander. Now we have it integrated into one component. So whether you're calling in as a vendor at 6 o'clock in the morning, or a vendor that's calling in at 4 p.m., they're going to get the same person or the same system. It's uniform, and it's really made our lives a lot easier.
When you were evaluating EDS, obviously there were those in favor of this transition, but on the flip side, were there some against the transition?
Listen, change in a police department is very, very difficult, and everybody's always skeptical when you have change. And the first thing we wanted to do is, once we felt that this was a program that was going to be right for us, we sat down with our union officials, and we went hand in hand throughout the entire process to make sure that they understood what we were looking to do, what this program would do for us, and how it could benefit them. And we took their opinion. And I will tell you, they were looking for options as well, because we felt that the system was broke. Whether it was or wasn't, that's not the question, but there was that thought that it was broke. So they were looking for options. So I think that they were receptive. They looked at it what we did. We took our time, and after having a pretty comprehensive review, we felt this was the best thing for us.
I can certainly see how the collaboration from both sides helped play a role in a positive outcome. Now that EDS has been working lockstep with your agency for some time now, what do you think the quote-unquote naysayers would say now about the transition to the EDS services?
Well, I would tell you universally, we don't have naysayers anymore. And to me, this is a burden that's taken off of me, right? This is one less issue that I have to deal with. I feel very comfortable, and I believe universally throughout the department, they feel very comfortable in this program.
Let's discuss the transition process in greater detail here. It sounds like you had some complex detail awarding procedures in place. So with that said, did the transition to EDS present any roadblocks, or was the transition smooth and streamlined?
It was actually very smooth. And what you need to do is, when you decide that this is the program you want, is you're going to sit down and you're going to map out comprehensively the program that you have. And we have something called a fairness rotation. And I will tell you, it started on paper, and then it went to an Excel spreadsheet, and it was convoluted. but we were able to take all those intricacies, work with representatives from extra duties, and once it was done, I will have to tell you, the transition was seamless.
Did you or your agency discover any unforeseen benefits since the implementation took place?
I don't know if I didn't expect, but I tell you, I didn't expect the transition to go so well, and it did. I didn't expect, or I expected to have some complaints throughout the time that we've had this, and I will tell you, I've had few, if none. I did expect that my clerk would be able to be more stress-free, and she is, and she's had more time to do her original responsibilities. And again, I go back to, I didn't want to stress out my officers. And I think that has been a big relief on their mind, that this works fair as it was supposed to work. And they're very comfortable when they either submit for a job, they get it, or they don't get it, they understand why. And to me, again, I go back to, it was a huge burden that was left off from me.
I think having that transparency is certainly key while creating a less stressful environment for your staff. Chief, I'd like to thank you again for your time. And before I let you go today, I have one last question. If there's someone from an agency right now who's considering partnering with a third-party administrator, what advice would you give them? And what would you say to them about extra duty solutions?
Well, I would tell them that, listen, you need to really go out and be able to see what the options are out there, because otherwise you may have skeptics. In the end, however, you're going to choose EDS because comprehensively they put the best program out there, not simply for your officers and for your management, but the other component is the cost, and it's cost effective for your taxpayers, which is a huge plus in this day and age.
Okay, great. That was Chief Zebrowski of Sayreville PD, located in New Jersey. Thank you again, Chief, for your time today. Looks like we're a few minutes past the half-hour mark here, so for those who'd like to stay on for the last portion, we're going to go ahead and get right into the Q&A. If you have any questions for Rich, feel free to enter them in the chat box below, and we're going to try to get to as many of them as possible over these next few minutes. Lastly, if you're interested in scheduling a free consultation with one of our extra duty experts to learn more about our services, please let us know in that chat box, and we'll have someone reach out shortly after the webinar to schedule that consultation for you and your agency. Thanks again, guys, for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you on our future webinars. The Q&A is now open.